Hello everyone. Very good morning, very good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are listening to us. The Life of Feast podcast series. Today, we are joining you for the fourth episode of our podcast series, the second season of it. And today, we have another special guest, Professor Swetha Rao Dhananka. So, she's joining us to discuss about her experiences about the waste management that she has seen and been part of. The Spirit projects and the R4D project as well. So she would like to share her observations and her experience with us today. So thank you so much, Swetha, for joining us. But before continuing, I would like to invite you to introduce yourself to our audience a little bit and share with us, what you have been doing in the past few years in terms of waste management.
Great. Thank you so much, Malik, to have me on the podcast. It's always a privilege to be conversing with you. Yes, so my interest in waste management actually started after my postdoc fellowship that I had between UCL London and the IHS Institute in Bangalore, which was financed by the Swiss National Science Foundation. So after my postdoc research, which was a little bit on the sociology of urban planning, I was researching peripheries. And after that research, when I was interested in peripheries of large metropolitan cities in India, I got in touch through a common platform with a local NGO, which was called Environment Support Group. And as it was a family project and we were staying on in Bangalore, yes, I was trying to occupy myself. So the NGO got me on board. And they were at the time working really on an open dump or a landfill site, and the affected communities then. So actually, a socioeconomic health survey was going on there, and for me, it was really nice to actually put my kind of research skills to use for a real concrete case that which was quite the work of that NGO was quite impactful. So it was really a great privilege for me to put my skills to use there, and it was a huge learning curve for me working with the NGO, not really in a scientific realm, but really in a kind of in an action mode, but still putting my skills into perspective. And after that, I was privileged to be coming back to Switzerland with a job in hand. And this was the University of Applied Sciences and Arts, Western Switzerland, the School of Social Work in Fribourg, which took me on as a professor. And indeed, my practice experience, in particular with this NGO and kind of the community approach that we incorporated in that work, was valuable for this university and also for the teaching. And yes, I'm privileged to work at that University of Applied Sciences, which is a different kind of university in Switzerland. And yes, I enjoy still a diversity of projects, very local, very grounded, some of them academic, some of them international. And yes, happy to be part of this spirit team fully. With the R4D, I was a little bit distant. I just had worked a little bit on the proposal. But yeah, really cool to be working with all of you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Swetha. Now, this surprises me because I knew that you were part of the R4D program, but I did not know that you started off immediately after your PhD with work related to waste management. So that's yeah, I'm also learning new things about you and your work today. So thank you, Swetha, for that introduction. I think which is really important for our readers to understand the context and why you're important. So before I move on to the first question, I should also inform our viewers that Swetha was a big part of both our projects, R4D and Spirit Board. So as she said, in Spirit, she was more hands-on in the project, but with R4D, I knew that she was part of the proposal writing part, which actually was quite a long process for our viewers who maybe would like to know a little bit about getting a grant, writing a proposal. Swetha is the one to is the one to go for, even though she's shaking her head. She's an expert in this. Because getting a grant for a project, a big time project, is quite challenging, right? From what I remember, it took almost 1.5 years maybe to get the grant. I think it was in the first time it was not successful, but when with the learned lessons, the proposal was further developed and we submitted. I think the proposal is actually available as a journal article in Rio journals. You can check it out. I will actually I'll put a copy of the link in our description. So if you guys are interested, you can actually check it out and see what it is. So thank you, Swetha, again for the proposal, and also which also gave me the opportunity to work in the waste management field. We would like to move on to the first question. Swetha, now you have already answered for the first part of this question, which is my question is actually what actually motivated you to um, study about waste management, the waste flow, the waste system, the urban material flows. So now, of course, your expertise lies in social work, which is another interesting area, which is an tremendously area of interest, especially in context of South Asia. So I would like you to enlighten us a little bit. So what really motivated you? I know that now we know that the first and foremost thing was your first job was on waste management.
So my first like NGO job involved waste management, and this was after kind of a postdoc research. But I would like to go back to my PhD research, which was on housing and also the city of Bangalore in southern India, where I have extended family. I had babysitting to do my research, so some pragmatism in there. But what always kind of really marked me, yeah, having family in India, but growing up in Switzerland, was this stark social inequality that was really seen very openly in India and not so much in Switzerland. And of course, the incredible rate of urbanization that actually the city of Bangalore kind of went through, especially after the 1990s with the economic liberation. And, it's become kind of the world's IT hub. So that was really kind of a very marked urbanization process. And if we look a little bit the backdrop of waste production in today's age, I mean it's really quite impressive. So some figures from UN Habitat that I dug out. So they say by 2050, 2.5 billion people will be living in urban areas. Most of the growth happening, so 90% of the growth happening in Asia and Africa. 1.1 billion people were living in informal settlements, and the right to adequate housing and the claim to adequate housing was actually part of my PhD. So I did research slums and their communities and their claims. And 70% globally of houses in the global south are self-built, no? So not by developers. That means access to urban infrastructure is not equal. At the same time, we have this situation. There's a really fantastic map by the ILO which shows the percentage of workers working in the informal economy, which waste workers are hugely a part of. And you see that most of the global south, especially kind of sub-Saharan Africa, but also parts of Asia, it's like super dark blue. That means almost 80 to 90% are working in the informal economy. And this means that these growing cities really have a little tax base, no? Little public resources available for infrastructure. And we also know that treating solid waste management, of course, with the huge consumption growth that has happened, takes up almost 20 to 30% of the municipal budgets, which is actually huge. So, of course, then kind of open dumping is like the most efficient and very cheap way to do it. And a World Bank study from 2018 actually says that in South Asia, 75% of the waste is dumped in open dumps. And I had not actually imagined kind of the waste scenarios when I was studying like slums in Bangalore at all. It was really working with this NGO and making visits to the periphery where there was an open dump that really opened my eyes to the kind of the entire chain of human activity and urbanization, and also kind of the politics of it and the toll of to the earth and the people working on it. So that was quite an eye-opening exercise, this survey for this site. And that actually, the context was that this NGO, so Environment Support Group, was already working since a long time with the community affected by the open dump there. It was actually the community that had kind of heard of the work of this NGO, and they contacted them. And the NGO they were quite famous for doing structural work. I'll explain what that really is. In assisting the community to reason in terms of what their rights are. Yeah. To build capacity of leadership within the community and really reason what is our stake, what are our rights, and how do we promote this. And some easy questions are to say, okay, what kind of land is it that the land is dumped? To whom does it belong? How is it regulated? What are our rights? To which jurisdiction do we belong to then go and claim rights? So this is really kind of the procedural knowledge that the NGO gave them, and they assisted them also kind of in documenting scientifically the pollution. So it starts with a story of a farmer that gives land to the city to dump, because after the 1990s, really consumption goes very high with the economic liberalization. So in the year 2000, this man called Bailappa, he gives land for dumping and excavations for dump. So there are photos that we have collected with really huge lines of trucks coming from the center of the city towards the northern periphery to just dump there. And that land actually was very famous for for as grazing land. So the milk that the cattle would yield in that periphery was very famous because it was of good quality. There was a river passing by there, and the people knew how to use the land. So the dump was happening there. And then, of course, people started protesting because it got polluted, it started stinking, and all the kind of physiological effects that open dump has. And after kind of collecting evidence and also showing that the farmer had actually himself encroached public forest land, which is quite paradoxal.
Yeah.
It was closed in 2005, but then there was a private company that came in to do a scientific job of it, so really a scientific landfill, which really didn't happen either. So the leachate, so really the toxic juice of all the waste would still trickle down. So then closures happened, demonstrations happened, they blocked the road so that the waste couldn't come there. And really the city started sinking. So really this kind of NIMBY effect of, the waste from the consumers is out of sight, out of mind out there was really in their face, in their street. Okay. And again, then at that time, they could bring up a little bit more claims. So they did again more in 2015 another scientific study to draw attention to the regulatory authorities. And what they did was through the public interest litigation, it's the legal instrument to bring issues of public interest to court, to actually bring a high court judgment that the waste should be segregated at source. So that was 2016 kind of new rules for waste management came out in the city because also of this PIL, but there were also other groups mobilizing on this. And then so I was involved in 2017 to kind of repeat the survey because the plights of the people there living where I was really bad. So in terms of health, in terms of pollution, no drinking water, so they had to fix drinking water fountains from outside, and that became also a political issue. There was no food stock for the cattle there. Daily laborers didn't have enough work. A lot of sickness that cost the families a lot. So spike in cancer treatments, but also impoverishment because of the health treatments and because of lack of livelihoods, and also large community impacts, like children not coming back home to celebrate festivities because the environment is bad, young people from those communities not finding grooms and brides to get married because nobody wants to come and live in the village, people actually leaving their own houses to go and live in slums in the cities because it's not viable anymore. And of course, lots of politics, lots of institutional irresponsibility also, and also messy politics because that place became close to the international airport where the land value then also rose. So yeah, so you all of it is there in terms of environmental, social justice, micro, meso, macro, name it, everything is there. And what was then super interesting, no? So we did this 2017 study and presented it through a press conference to the large public in 2018, and then had the privilege to come back with this job in hand back to Switzerland. And then in 2021, it was huge news in Lausanne, where you now live, that there is a dioxin soil pollution in Lausanne.
Oh.
And my colleagues from ESG India then kind of called me up and say, hey, what's happening in Lausanne? What kind of NGOs are working on it? What can we learn from each other? What is happening? And then, of course, I tried to see online who is working on it. There were just kind of journalistic reports and government statements, and no civil society organization working
Wow.
on it, no citizens group. And yeah, so I said that, and then I was like, what does it say about our societies as well? When such kind of a environmental injustice and pollution happens, kind of who is concerned about it and how big does it become? So it was an interesting experience.
Hmm. So this shows me, Swetha, that even though one of the key things that Swetha often says in our private conversations or in our meetings as well is that she does not have much field experience. I would like to differ actually after learning the amount of work that you've done in India. And also, I think, Swetha, one thing that really caught my eye was that how much of like how many similarities there exist between Sri Lanka and India in
Oh
terms
yeah,
of open dumping. The stories that you were telling of families refusing to get married into the area because of these challenges brought forth by the dumping site, which this is quite evident in Sri Lanka as well, in Karadhiana,
yeah,
which is the dumping site that we studied extensively after the collapse of the Mitharamunta garbage dump in 2017. So Karadhiana, when we initially visited, I can remember family members and residents in that area telling us, how they are sort of socially um, stigmatized and marginalized and labeled as unclean because of their proximity to the dumping site. So this reminded me of how, despite the change, the differences that we have, in terms of landmass, the size of the country, the economic prowess, how similar phenomena can create similar issues and problems for people. Um, Swetha, thank you so much for enlightening us about what motivated you to start your studies about waste work. But also, I thought it would be quite interesting for our viewers to also to get to know, So you are studying on waste management, and then you are also a social worker, which is your primary academic concern right now as of teaching. So before we move on to the second question, could you maybe take this opportunity to maybe explain a little bit what social work is? Is it similar to social service or is it a bit different to that?
yeah. So that's a good question. Just maybe to come back to your point, like, yeah,
Yeah,
how I got into this. I must say, even the proposal writing it was under the leadership of René Veron, right? And
of
of
course.
course, I'm motivated for this team, but it's also thanks for his invitation to be part of this team that I'm part of the spirit team. It's just to on record. Yes. So what is social work? So yes, it's true that was my first training, and then I got back to this. I'm very happy about it. So one must say that social work doesn't have the same standing all over the world, and that's why
Mhm.
your question is the same as social service, yes or no.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, so it has different connotations in different places. It's contextualized differently. So we have a global federation that is called the International Federation of Social Work that I'm also part of, and part of the UN Commission, which kind of represents the profession at the UN. So me particularly with the team in Geneva. And by the global definition of IFSW, it is a profession, it is a discipline, and it is also a practice. Yeah.
Mhm.
And these three, they ground themselves in ethical principles that incorporate typically human rights, social justice, equality, diversity, kind of what all you find in the preamble of human rights, kind of such principles, and it also incorporates knowledge, scientific knowledge from various similar disciplines, but also indigenous knowledge. So what is particular about social work as a discipline compared to, for example, sociology, anthropology, psychology, is it actually takes a stand. So social workers are supposed to document, work for, promote, advocate for the most vulnerable in society because of the global principle. I think this is kind of very unique for an academic discipline or profession, because we have a professional code. So every country that has built up social work as a profession or is professionalizing this activity will have a professional code that abides by these ethical principles. And that means we kind of take sides. We are not kind of the neutral, observant scientists like sociologists or anthropologists to say, okay, we understand this, we analyze this, and we leave it to you. So social work kind of takes sides and generally tries to take sides of the most vulnerable and the voiceless. So that is very particular. And in contexts where social work is not professionalized, for example, there is lack of trainings, diplomas, or a professional code, we tend to say that people who engage in practice, so that means supporting people, communities at the meso, macro, or micro level, which are coherent to those ethical principles, we say that yes, they are practicing a social work activity based on those principles. So that is, I think, quite unique. But of course, then every country has their own trajectory of how social work has built up. And in particular, if we still look at the global definition that stems from 2014, it does not talk about environmental justice or the rights of nature, for example. But the global discourse from these global organizations, so IFSW is only one, there are two, three others, they have really diffused with quite a bit of effort to also incorporate environmental injustice, especially in this era of environmental degradation and climate urgency, to say that very often those communities that are already socially marginalized, who suffer social injustice, are those who are most prone to suffer environmental justice. And hence, environmental justice is kind of incorporated in the larger sense of the social injustice. And social work, the model of social work actually grounds on a systemic model of the individual. We call it person and environment. And as for now, the environment in social work, the way it's been taught through kind of dominance of a global north scholarship, one must say that it has been taught the environment of the person being really at the micro, meso, macro level, being part of the social environment. So social work diagnosis will go, okay, the primary socialization, spheres, school, family, how does that happen, peers of the people, and then the meso, like, again, the family, the other institutions, social institutions that support, and then larger, of course, the policies and institutions in context. And now we're kind of expanding that notion of personal environment to say it doesn't only include the social environment, but also the physical and the natural environment to get these environments also imbricated, to also understand how they're interrelated.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Swetha. Because the reason that I asked, I was reading Ananya Roy yesterday, and she talks about these common sense definitions of disciplines. Back home, and also I've seen this everywhere actually. The common sense definition often says that often equates social work with social services. So often this is the general public's opinion now what social work is. I have had the instances where people question, oh, so is it a job, or how do you make an income? What kind of work you do, isn't it similar to social service? So this is why I asked the question when we have a professor of
No,
social
but
work here.
it's such a good question, because at least here in the north, the imaginary of social work is really service. So that means, the
Yeah,
beneficiary of the community has to go to a place where social workers are. Generally, they're part of a bureaucracy or
yeah,
a social service, and then it's administrative, and then it's annoying. And but you get social aid to really reach the kind of minimum dignitary social threshold to
Mhm.
participate in society. But
Yeah.
what social work really is, it's also community work. It's all those community workers who are there with the people, and they're at the pulse really at what's happening with communities. But it's also those who advocate for rights, right? So social workers are everywhere, and I think it's mainly the global south that are teaching us, how to deal with environmental justice and its implication with
Mhm.
social justice, and to say that tree planting is also social work, and that
Yeah.
social work is not only within institutions but is out there where people are. And I think these kind of solidarity and support system that already exists within communities, because the notion of community is also much stronger
Mhm.
in the global south. I think there's a lot to learn from that and to strike a balance, where do we need kind of societal solidarity infrastructures like insurances, pensions, and all of that, and where can we enhance the existing community infrastructures that already exist? So that is kind of an ongoing debate.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think what Sweta's Sweta's explanation about social work is important for us, because now that would also aid us to make like to get an understanding, like how that sort of also motivated, because social work is such a subject that encompasses maybe almost all the major social sciences and humanities into one particular discipline. It's so overarching. So how did that influence you when it comes to drafting the first proposal with Winnie, in framing it, because you have framed it in a very interesting way, which is something that we also together try to address later on. That is crisis crisis management and waste. Basically, that was our focus in R4D, and we were trying to understand how each country, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and India, has coped with the crisis, and we were looking at different crisis events. So, how did you thought of this when you were focusing on developing the first proposal for the MSWM project, as I call it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in both projects we are still kind of more sociological, geographical than social work, because social work research, of course, tries to understand and describe, but we are not yet focusing too much on the intervention component, and we are not too much doing action research, but we are nevertheless documenting the lives and the effects of waste on the waste workers, and I think there we have kind of compelling stories of how it's affecting them in terms of environmental and social justice. But we are also digging out very positive stories, of how communities can come together, assist themselves, to see waste as a resource and to really build from that. And I feel especially your work, the shadowing exercise that you have shown us, it actually shows us, despite the harsh working conditions, and despite that they're handling waste, which is a discard from society and all the stigma and everything, these people were able to build a livelihood and raise a family. And I think it's important to see that waste work very often it's like the first kind of jumping point for the poorest of the poor. I mean,
Mhm.
informal or formal, I think it has the possibility to really integrate the poorest of the poor into some kind of a labor market relationship. Now the question is, even though they get a livelihood, which is, and the conditions are so not decent, is how to get recognition of their work to really build and advocate for decent work conditions. Because,
Mhm.
especially in the NGO work, because we also studied at the time the sweepers of the city, we used to call them, they are the first doctors of the city. Because
Mhm.
if we don't live in a hygienic place, then everybody will fall sick. And of course, doctors have high prestige, they invest a lot in study, they need their infrastructure. But the first doctors who just keep our cities clean, they don't enjoy that prestige, not at all, and the infrastructure they need as well, right? I mean, sometimes I'm appalled by what kind of working tools they are given.
Mhm.
Sometimes they're not adequate, so hence they don't use it because of the heat. I mean, we experience that all with the PPP equipment during COVID, and sometimes it's just not ergonomic.
mm,
I mean, yeah, you know these things better, and also our colleagues in Nepal through the Women's Cooperative. I think it's a very nice example how that community got into a commoning exercise. And I feel what the women's cooperative shows in Nepal, for example, is really kind of a mirror of Ostrom's work about
mm,
governance of the commons, where they actually see waste as a resource to build livelihood. But around that, they have created in a self-determined manner. So self-determination is one of also the very important principles of social work that I didn't mention
mm,
before. But in an auto-determined manner, they kind of put up credit systems for women to access when their families are in crisis, or governance system of how to use the trucks otherwise than only waste pickup, how to manage health within that group, and how to really also bargain negotiating power as a group. So I think waste is an incredible sector to display really the implicatedness of social and environmental justice,
mm,
but also to see how something that is considered a discard and that is so stigmatized can be actually transformed into something that brings livelihood. But we have a long way to go for those working conditions to be dignified. I just
mm,
read on LinkedIn very recently a post by the Global Alliance of Waste Pickers, that very recently at the COP in Belém in Brazil, they were kind of recognized in their participation, and that they have to have a voice really in future climate proofing of their activity. And they had posted this with quite some pride that they
oh,
got a recognition from the UN COP. Yeah, so it's nice to see that even the poorest of the poor are being organized at scale, and they are kind of celebrating their recognition. And nevertheless, it's sad to see that the first doctors of the city are in such quest of recognition. And I think in the project, for example, we do highlight that also with the discourse analysis that you have done. I mean, maybe you can speak more about it, but it was interesting in Sri Lanka how they turned from stigmatized workers to heroes for a short period
mm.
during COVID.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Swetha. I think that's one of our most interesting findings, actually. We had the opportunity to write a discourse paper on this. What we found out was that temporarily, the status of waste collectors or waste workers of the municipal councils, at least, was elevated to the levels of the soldiers, the doctors, the nurses, who were the first responders when it came to the COVID-19 and the challenges it sort of created for the whole society. And this was quite evident for a short while. They were featured on advertisements. There were certain cartoons, which I'll be putting a link to to our discourse paper here, so that you can have a look at it also. But of course, it was short-lived. We talked about heroization. The one thing is, which I also learned by doing the literature review and then also further exploring this, that being a hero is challenging. It's good, it's nice. People respect you. In the case of waste workers, it was quite temporary, but when you are marked as a hero, if you're labeled as a hero, this heroization sort of brings a positive stigmatization, which, as the word suggests, is still stigmatization despite its being positive. So you're expected to dedicate your life for the well-being of others when you're a hero, right? So the waste workers were doing exactly that, and yeah, we found
Yeah,
out many interesting things there as well. But thank you, Swetha, for reminding me of that. But let us move back to the project and our findings. Even though, as you said, We're not fully part and parcel of the first R4D project in the field, but through the Spirit project, you were fully part of the project, and you took part in almost all the project meetings, and you went to the field, not just here, but also you have a PhD student in Nepal, our dear Tenas. So now you have a very, very broad understanding of what has been going on in the southern cities. So initially, for the information of our viewers, so initially our first project, R4D, was focused on how India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, focusing on Colombo, Nepal, Kathmandu especially, and in Kerala, in Trivandrum, the focus was on identifying and understanding how the waste management sort of faced and experienced and coped with crises. These were local level crises. And then in 2019, there was the COVID-19 pandemic, which superseded all of these conditions and impacted each and every dimension of social life, political life, and economic life. And so we got the opportunity to study that as well. And out of that COVID pandemic and its experience, our field experience and our findings, came the second project, Spirit Project, which focused on specifically studying what happened in during and after the COVID-19 period. And the project is still going on. So Sweta, so can you please enlighten us? So through all this experience, what does waste, its production, handling, and governance reveal about the cities in global South? You have the liberty of either doing a general description or going through each city separately.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Sometimes I'd like to map it. If you look at a household, and if you look at their dustbin or how they would put away their waste, it tells you about the family, how they live, how ecologically conscious they are, probably what kind of consumption they have, what social class they are. So it tells you a lot about their life, right? And if you see that at a higher scale, at a city level, I think the way it's discarded, who works in waste, what is the composition of waste, it tells us a lot about that society. And so I think you can map it that way. So the trigger was, of course, the crisis kind of dimension. I think is transversal to the R4D project and the Spirit project. The Spirit, of course, COVID, and one, of course, must acknowledge that in South Asia, in particular Nepal, Sri Lanka, COVID was another crisis. And I think when I had the privilege to accompany Tanaz in her fieldwork, and the conversation with the government and the fieldwork that you had organized for us, one sees that yes, measures were mobilized, it was done, but then things kind of balance back to the everyday life, because yes, it's one of the other crises that people are facing, but it was nevertheless interesting to see on what kind of policy and legal grounds some measures were mobilized. For example, in Nepal, it was an emergency act that dated way back before decentralization, and that's the way it was just justified. And we could also see, uh, government offices working more or less in silos despite the emergency. So that way it's interesting. But all in all, I think if we again go to say, okay, what does the garbage say about our society? When we see like where it's disposed. Now, if you just go through the what, where, how, all these WW questions, if you just see where it's disposed, I mean, the politics of land siting for the open dumps, it's really interesting, because it speaks of social injustice, because generally it's there where people are marginalized, so they don't have a voice very often, even though Tenaski is not necessarily so, but it's tucked away in Nepal, in Kathmandu, in the rugged territory where you really have to take that road down there to see that there is a dump. So kind of the territory hides it. And it was interesting to see when we went to Karanya in Sri Lanka, all of the sites are ecologically sensitive. Everywhere there are streams, which then carry forward the pollution. But in a way, it's visible, and the landfill is so visible and so stark. I mean, just the visual of it. I mean, I think, and the stench of it, nobody will forget. But the percolation of the leachate and the pollution, in a way, remains invisible. And I was just the last week giving a lecture at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and my colleague there, who is Swiss, she says, "Wow, but I don't think here in Switzerland it's so different. It's just invisible." She was just talking about, yeah, I live in Lausanne, and I took my dog around for a walk, and on the meadow it says, don't let your dog and pets kind of dig because of the dioxin soil pollution. But then she remembered, oh my God, but my children played on this playground, when they were little. So things are more invisible and kind of tucked away also in terms of discourse here, but it's there. If we look at, again, who are waste workers, again, that tells us a story of, in general, like marginalized communities, low class, low caste, often rural, urban migrants being in there, also kind of enduring these this environmental justice because of undecent working condition. And in a way, waste really becomes kind of a societal moral dilemma,
Yes.
because how I really feel, and if you look at how the need for intercommunity solidarity and investment is required in this sector and is not happening, it really becomes a societal moral issue. So that, in that sense, I feel it's really important, the kind of discursive dimension and the politics dimensions that we're undertaking in these countries. Like, how is it tolerated that people like you and me, who are actually taking care of our waste, are working in such conditions? I mean, the formal workers, as you yourself have documented so well, are a little better off, a little bit at least with future social protection. But the informal workers, they're of course the first to lose their livelihood during COVID. That was also shown. The conditions are really bad for them. And if we see at a global level, in terms of today's imperatives of achieving some social threshold and having economic activities within planetary boundaries, especially in today's world, the global picture says that no country is really in the quadrant where they achieve social threshold, so good social protection and living conditions and working conditions, and they do not transgress ecological ceilings. There is really no country in that quadrant, if you see the analysis. And that says I think a lot about how we still accept inequality. And I think there is a big question about the institutions. How strong are institutions? How responsible are they? And how strong are civil societies to also claim this accountability from institutions? So that was also kind of an interesting lesson when I came back. And NGOs like the one I was working for in Bangalore was really claiming this institutional responsibility from the Karnataka Pollution Board, from the High Court, from the municipality, and all these institutions. And at least there was some movement. There would be some things in the press, and of course, it's more in your face. But here, then it wasn't. Of course, waste collection and pollution. At least the waste collection is you're experiencing it now that you're living in Lausanne. It's quite streamlined. No, we segregate quite minutely at household levels since a long time. There are a lot of bins if you go to the municipal discard place. But it's also true that the figure comes from 2022 that Switzerland exports 827,000 tons of waste elsewhere, and that figure has doubled within the last decade. So it also tells a lot about global hierarchies and interdependencies. And yeah, I can go into the what as well. Of course, in COVID, we see that there's more medical waste, that the stigmatization is more because the waste workers are seen as vectors of contamination. But I think that there is enough. I think we have spoken a lot about the waste compositions and all of that. I think also goes along with really at what state of urbanization the the cities are the global interdependencies, and I'm sure, I mean, you might remember your grandmother's kitchen or your grandparents' house. There was
Mhm.
hardly any plastic. No, it was kind of
Yeah,
all steel, wood, textile, and a lot of
yeah,
composting done at home. I mean, I remember my grandparents' kitchen, and also just the global economy and the consumerism has elevated so much, and especially for the poorer segments. I mean, the cheapest materials are the ones that are most difficult to treat in terms of waste management. Of
yeah,
course, lots of plastic and composites, which are bad for Earth. And even though we have lots of technology, consumer choices is obviously going for cheap products, and that does not help. So I think the waste sector actually demands to systemically rethink everything. I mean, whom we stigmatize and why, and how we consume. And it's a very interesting kind of lab to rethink society. I mean, of course, there are push for circular economies and cooperative and commoning and all of that. And these are just at the experimental phase, but it's not been adopted as a whole city as a region. So these are the future experimentations that are really due. And I think studies like ours are illuminating. They also invite a lot of interprofessional and interdisciplinary collaboration to put this in motion. And there's lots of scope, but it is urgent and also moral issue, I think.
yeah. I think one of the key things with that from our the both of our projects that we also realized was, how important is contextualized solutions. We often saw in different parts of, especially when speaking about Sri Lanka, we saw that technologies would be imported in without really contextualizing them, and then they would fail horrendously, and that would complicate the situation even more. So, with that remark, I would also like to get your opinion on, how should waste be approached in the southern cities? Do you think that it should be because there's a large push from governments now to go to technocratic sort of solutions, resolve everything with machines. Incinerators is the newest trend when it comes to waste management now, and then chemical treatment, these kind of new technocentric approaches. But then, through especially when we speak about circular economies, we also talk about more sustainable solutions like reduction of waste, maybe further segregation, as you discussed about how waste is segregated in Switzerland, which is a bit of issue in southern part of the world. So, what sort of approach should we have? What sort of a balance that we should look for?
Especially in the sustainability area and connection with social work, I really believe that we need to nourish the imaginary of alternatives at every level, like at the consumer level. So, for example, it's especially that the waste sector is so characterized by this NIMBY phenomena. I think it's so important that when waste is segregated locally, that the local ward or the local neighborhood organizes every now and then kind of walks for the citizens or anything to see really the waste chain. I think if people, I mean, it was marking for me as well and for us, I think as a team, when we go and see these dump sites and we see the conditions where people work, we actually understand, okay, what is our stake and what is our responsibility in it. And I feel one should see what the reality is and how harsh it is. Because at least in Bangalore, I still have lots of households. I know these are kind of just everyday talk. It's like, yeah, they make us I mean, when the new rules came up in 2016, oh, they make us segregate, and they thought it's like a huge job. And in many middle class households, the domestic aid would do that. But they saw it as a big job, and they didn't trust the process. No, they said, I'm sure anyway they're all going to dump it, in one, and we don't know what it happens. So
Yeah.
I think really experiential learning, the visceral kind of learning of waste through the stench and the look of these landfills, I think that should be promoted. Then with the promotion also with imagining alternatives, like fine segregation at source, and then mainly also questioning what waste workers themselves would see like better conditions for them, because
Mhm.
it is, I mean, you brought up this waste to energy plants and all of that. I mean, we've seen all these countries, Nepal, India, and Sri Lanka, they governments invite the Netherlands or the USA or for consultants to say how to better set up waste to energy plants. I have part of our survey was also to go and see all the kind of waste related infrastructures around the city, and we went to see a very kind of hi-fi methanization plant. But we could also see that the maintenance then is very particular to that technology, and hence the building the capacity is not always very easy, because the networks of public-private contracts is sometimes a bit messy as well.
Yeah.
So building the capacity of maintenance sometimes it's difficult, and hence these infrastructures are there, and they don't function the way they should, or they have long gaps of function. And one must recognize, nevertheless, that the waste domain is a livelihood option. And in many of the cases where, in particular, the municipality has outsourced the waste collection or the waste disposal and treatment to private companies because they don't have their own capacities,
Mhm.
what happens is these private companies, they go and recruit workers, very vulnerable workers, from really elsewhere. Like
Mhm.
in India, we know that lots of people from Bangladesh come into waste work, or maybe really rural migrants. They get into waste work, and these private companies recruit them because they have more difficulty to unionize, right? So if you don't give people the opportunity to unionize, then they will always be like a little bit in a lower bargaining power situation, and they can't kind of go and claim. But instead of always seeing like this confrontation of claiming and oppression, we could also kind of see it like, why don't we co-build? And I think that is kind of also the discourse that social work tries to embody. Like people who work in it, who suffer from it, they are the best experts of their own lived experience. So how to engage them to co-build forward better? And for that, we need to have really institutions and politicians that listen, because it is a collective problem. Waste generally, it's not. There needs at least some coordination capacity by the government. So that's why we're talking
Mhm.
about governance here. And they should be able to listen and actually acknowledge the expertise that these most uneducated and marginalized communities have. And it becomes again a little bit of a power game. And I think
Mhm.
that's where kind of NGOs, social workers can assist, to really build forward on self-determined propositions of waste workers, because they are the first doctors of the city, really.
Yeah, I think that's a extremely important point, Swetha, because from my experience in Sri Lanka specifically, what I remember is that these workers, they're doing a tremendous amount of work, and for such a little pay, facing all these challenges from not just we often think of these are people who work with waste, so it is the work itself is challenging, but it's also what our research have proven is that being a waste worker is way more than being a waste worker, as in simply collecting waste. You need to play multiple roles. You need to be a communicator. You need to be enforcer of laws,
Yes.
and once in a while you need to also control traffic because you're going in such a huge vehicle and collecting waste on the main road. You become a traffic control as well. And then you need to also sort of manage day-to-day challenges through everyday practices. Especially in South Global South, where it's quite hot and humid, and waste goes bad quite quickly, and then you have to cope with that as well. And then often there are protests and agitations against dumping site, and then on top of all of that, there's a huge stigmatization and labeling of waste workers to be unclean. So they are sort of untouchables in a way, in terms of Sri Lankan context. So it is it's such an important point that you brought up. And finally, Sweta, as we are getting closer to our conclusion, so being a social worker yourself and being a sort of authority in social work in Switzerland and in terms of academia. So how can social work contribute to waste management in global south? I know that already. For me, I'm thinking of how you can utilize social work to improve the lives of waste workers themselves. Maybe help them to see themselves in a different way, see their value, and to strengthen them and to give them advocacy. But this is what this looks. My proposition seems to be the most obvious one. What are the not so obvious ones?
What do you mean by obvious? What is obvious? So,
The obvious the proposition of mine would be to empower wage workers, help them realize their dreams and goals.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Social work goes beyond that, right?
yeah. Yeah, so my practice experience is rather little in regard to, so I'm more a social work educator or a researcher now. But I think it's bringing parties together and to
Uh-huh.
facilitate to listen to each other and valorize each voices to their kind of dignitary weight. Let's say. So empowerment just doesn't only happen like, okay, we empower, for example, the women's cooperative in Nepal that our colleagues have researched. Obviously, they've done an incredible job of being what they are. This cooperative where the women are happy and they feel strong because they've been exposed to many things. But it's also in the relationship and in the exchange with others
Hmm.
that they feel strong.
Yeah.
So it's because they got the government to recognize them as a cooperative and their work that they feel strong. It's because they get the recognition of their husbands to say, oh yes, if I need a truck and if I behave well, the truck of my wife's cooperative actually lends it to me. Or it's because they get the recognition within their community in crisis, they got a credit line from the cooperative. So it's always in relation to other actors that empowerment gets nourished and you get the recognition. So I think social workers are well positioned also because of the skills they have, is to really bring people together around an issue.
Mhm.
So all the stakeholders or all people who are supposed to be partnering together to bring them together to understand each other's pain and to also to really deeply listen how they see a better future together. And even though this sounds quite simple, it sounds like, okay, just fix a date, bring everybody around the table and let's talk. It's in reality, it's not so simple because you'll have to work with people who are not at ease in speaking in public or who are always been stigmatized and have low confidence. How to get their voices recognized and out in front of others? Do you do kind of bilaterals and then do you represent them or not? How do you deal with historic injustice and historic stigmas about communities that are just not listened to? How do you consider a politician's kind of trajectory where he's loyal to some communities and has probably commitments to other stakeholders. It's a very, very, very messy affair. So scientific inquiry in just understanding the dynamics is very valuable. In that sense, it's really great, for in particular in Sri Lanka, how the Federation of Local Municipal Governments is part of this project, and they're really interested. At every retreat, they're there to listen to us. So it's really, really nice that such stakeholders are actually interested in research, and I think the way you've put that body on board is incredibly important because that's where research actually makes sense to real world problems. And so yeah, so I kind of a sociopolitical diagnostics of what's happening is obviously what we can bring, but then social workers can bring people together to listen and to recognize each other's point, but it is really how to bring that about. That means the entire job, to put it in one phrase, yes, is to have people participate in the decisions that affect them. And the social worker's job is to create conditions of participation where equity is assured. Because again, a politician will easily speak loudly at a forum and a waste worker will not.
Mhm.
And we will not understand the entire kind of background dynamics that comes with what they present, right? It's kind of deciphering
Yeah.
that and creating equal conditions of participation for things that affects them and their environment.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting, as you explained, so the wastegate in general is very complex. It might look like such a simple process of disposal, collection, collection and disposal in that order, but it involves different dimensions of people's life, social, economic, political, and then beyond that, you also see that there's this hybridity of formality and informality involved in it, as you said. So politicians, while they're being responsible to the voter base, they're also responsible to other parties who actually help them to come into
Exactly.
power.
Yeah, you were
And
spelling it out very nicely.
yeah, exactly. And also the same thing with the waste collectors. Most of these waste collectors are in liaison with the politicians. Most of them have been taken in by different politicians. So there's always this tension of power between the waste workers and other parties. So then, once recruited by politicians, there are clashes in terms of to whom you should listen to. Should I listen to the authority who's responsible in terms of administrative work, or should I listen to the politicians? So this further complicates the situation. Actually, so your point of the social workers role in sort of bringing everyone together and bringing out these smaller things and doing a diagnostic report sort of reminded me of James Scott's idea of metis, where he sort of explains how informality in general it brings forth this sort of knowledge which he terms metis, which is contextualized and localized experience-based knowledge. So it's not just the waste workers, but also the politicians, the administrative staff. They have knowledge which is not really formal, but which is the informal, informal knowledge that actually runs the thing. So the sort of the oil of the machine, or the
Absolutely.
petrol or diesel to the machine. So it's so complex. But thank you so much, Sweta, for bringing that to our discussion as well. And with that, I think it's time for us to conclude. We have had a very fruitful discussion today, a podcast. Thank you so much, Sweta. And I think maybe in the future we can have another podcast. Maybe I think it's we can have a discussion about this and how we can organize this. Maybe we can have a look at waste altogether, all of our findings through the lens of social work, trying to identify solutions, challenges, uh,
Yes, that's the next
social
project. What did you suggest?
yeah, yeah, it's gonna be it will be so interesting because as Sweta pointed out at the beginning of the podcast, waste is such an interesting area to explore because it encompasses every possible dimension of human life, and it is a issue that is going to stay as long as human beings are alive and thriving. So I would like to thank again Sweta for taking time
Thank you,
out of a
Malit, for
busy
this good
schedule.
discussion.
Of course, always a pleasure, Sweta, for joining our podcast. So the podcast will be out in one episode, I think, because it was not that long, so we can put it into one episode. So also, please know that our shorts will be available quite soon alongside the full video, so you can enjoy those as well for quick answers for our questions. So also, there are lots of other podcasts we have recorded early in our channel. Go and check them out as well. But again, I would like to thank you so much for joining with us, for listening to our podcast throughout, and also helping out with your viewership, which it really encourages us to continue to find new actors and new stakeholders to help us out, and also to record these kind of podcasts and disseminate our findings in this medium, not just in the medium of writing. Thank you again, Sweta, and have
Thank
a
you, Malit,
wonderful,
so much
wonderful
for
day.
this excellent conversation.
Thank you
Bye.
so much. Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.
You too. Bye.